Welcome to Badaboom. I'm Troy. On today's episode, we welcome back Janson Douglas. Janson has been a public school teacher for the last 25 years and found success with his very first book, Parallel, garnering him not one, but two Ringo Award nominations. His next project was a one-shot called Jane American, which was inspired by his late grandmother. With the success of the one-shot, Janson has returned to Kickstarter to fund the full original graphic novel. Listen in to hear more. Hey, Janson, how's it going?
It's going all right. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate your time. I'm ready to have a great time and talk about some good stuff.
Hey, no, we appreciate your time because I know comics isn't your first career. You've done lots of things in your life. You've been a public school teacher for many of those things. And what's that been like? You're still a public school teacher overall, but like, what's that been like, kind of having like the second career of a second, I don't want to say job because you put in more hours to this than you do any other job and also
Yeah,
into being a
it,
teacher. So what's that change
it's
kind of been like for you?
it's funny, and I think this might be the first time I'm saying this out loud, but it just popped in my head because the way you phrase that, it is a very interesting balancing act, not unlike what I've discovered writing a comic script is, right? So like, I've been a teacher and a comic fan and reader exponentially longer than I've been a creator. And so this idea of like when I first wrote my very first script, like one of the things that blew me away, because I was writing like one act plays before that for the drama clubs that I was running at middle school and elementary school level. And I remember like that thought was like, how I can do that. I can do that with one eye closed. Like, how hard could it be? And that kind of blissful ignorance of not knowing better and how much more complicated a comic script is than even like a stage play. And it's such a massive balancing act of all the different things you've got to keep in your mind that you don't have to, or at least not as many in other forms of writing to write a successful or at least transferable comic script that could be understandable to an editor, to a letterer, to an artist. And it's kind of a lot like how I'm dealing with life right now because it's like, being a parent, being a teacher, being a tutor, having I've got certain health problems. I'm battling colon cancer. I'm writing comic books. There's all these things that are all, I don't know, full-time jobs on their own, and to kind of like balance that and find the joy in it all still is, I mean, not insurmountable because I'm here talking to you today, but also like something that can be overwhelming when you stop and reflect on it. Like self-reflection is a really good, healthy thing, I think, for humans to do.
Totally.
But sometimes I like think about like all the stuff I got going on right now, and it freaks me out. So a balancing act for sure.
Yeah. And what's it kind of been like? Because I know you got all this stuff going on, and like you mentioned, it's a lot harder than what you think it is once you get into the reads of it. And I think like when I used to think about making comics, it's like, oh, you write a story, someone draws it, and then it's just put to print. But like we know, like in the world of comics, it's completely different from that. So what's it been like moving into the indie comic scene and being like, man, there's so much more to this than
Yeah.
just what people may think.
I think one of the biggest outcomes over the last like 4+ years that I've been doing this now is how I actually view being on this side of the process, how I actually read my comics now.
Mm,
Um, there's that kind of famous cliche about when you have a job at a restaurant, and you eat the food that you guys make there regularly, and eventually like you burn out on it, you never want to look at it again. And that has not happened to me with this. I read just as many comics as I ever have. I would read more, but time. But what I found is now knowing how the sausage is made, it hasn't turned me away from the comics I read, but instead have given me a much richer, deeper appreciation every time I read. I can open up a 22-page floppy, which as a kid, was like a couple minute endeavor, and then you're on to the next one. And now I can see months and sometimes years of work in it,
yeah.
especially in indie comics, where the blood, sweat, and tears is significantly, I mean, mostly because you don't have like 80 years of corporate machinery behind you. But in indie comics, that blood, sweat, and tears level of what goes into every graphic novel, every 32 to 64 page one shot, every 22-page floppy is something that I can kind of see between the panels, but doesn't take away from me getting lost in a good story either. So that's been one of the, like the most major things being on that side of it that I've noticed.
Yeah, I totally agree with that because as we've done this podcast more and more and we've talked with writers and illustrators, there's been, I feel like 10 minutes or so added to each issue I'm reading because you're going to read one page for the content, then you're going to go back and like look at all the pictures and be like, okay, I love how this is drawn and how the panels are laid out. And then it's like, okay, now what do they really want to tell me that's not on the surface of just the words in the picture? What's the clues that they're leaving in there? So as you get more into it, like you just know there's more to it than just the surface and you have to dive a lot deeper into.
Like when you turn a page and there's like a reveal on the turn or something on the facing page or the panels start to change shape and you're noticing that there's a deliberate, the pacing's being sped up or slowed down by panel size. um I mean, I think at some point, as a reader, maybe you instinctively, because it's designed that way, you feel the effect of that. But like if you create on your own and are, aware of why you would do that, how you would do that, it adds this layer of richness because like you get the reader effect of that slowdown or that speed up or that flip and that reveal. And then you go, oh, this is a deliberate choice being made by a human. Like I remember when I made that kind of choice and what is that leading? And it's almost like, I think you said it really well. It's almost like a different reading of it.
Yeah.
And not something that I personally feel takes away from it at all. I think it actually adds something for me to have. It's almost like getting your behind the scenes documentary. It's your DVD extras, it's your making of thing, and you get to kind of see it. And if you dig what you're reading, it's actually a cool bonus that you get once you're a creator yourself.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite things about like reading those comics is because it's a really rich book for only being like, 10, 20 pages, however much it is. And with your book, Jane American, like the first issue was out and you're doing like a Kickstarter for the full graphic novel. What's it been like trying to do these historically accurate aspects of a comic, but also be able to say, we're going to put these rich little details in there that make the pictures just engaging as the words, but also know we're keeping true to how things were during that time.
There's like these over the last few years, I believe I have discovered these truths about like who I am as a writer, like these things that I think are going to be fairly consistent in who I am. And one of them is absolutely that if I'm going to ask you to suspend your disbelief about anything, right? If I'm going to ask you, like in my first book, Parallel, if I'm going to ask you to believe that there's another version of you reaching out, offering you a second chance at dreams that you thought were gone forever, I'm going to make sure that everything else in that book is not going to take you out of the real experience. I'm going to make sure that when there's a medical situation and the words are being said that I made the phone call to my cousin, the doctor, and said, here's the situation. What exactly would this medical professional say in this situation? What is the thing? And if she didn't know, she found it. That kind of thing. Like, did the research? Like, what would the police say in this situation? So that all of it's real because I am. I get pedantic nerds because I'm a bit of a pedantic nerd myself, right? I mean, there's a reason why I don't watch, shows about teaching on television because just like when doctors watch, Grey's Anatomy or ER, as much as you might like the drama, like when something isn't exactly the way it is in real life, you roll your eyes and some of you shuts down. And I know I'm that way. And like with Jane American, I'm also a history nerd, and there's no way that I am willing to put at risk even one reader who might have a positive impact because of the powerful themes that are in this book when they look at the truck that's going down the road and go, wait a minute, isn't this in 1946? That didn't come out until 1955. Down to like the details of like the icebox in the kitchen and the phone on the wall. Or even, I mean, this is where I went minutia wise. Like if the family is not affluent, forget 1946. like that stuff's going to be from the 1930s. You know what I mean? And like I did a ton of research on that to make sure. And then because, Annie, my artist who's only 22 years old, is brilliant. Like came out of the art womb fully formed in so many ways. But she's also 22 and there hasn't been time to become a pedantic history nerd like me. So like the amount of research that I did on Jane is kind of troubled because like what I did with Parallel, because it is contemporary, it was a lot of research and then it's written into the script, and then an artist, because it's contemporary, can kind of just make the thing because it's all right at your fingertips. Whereas this, like literally, it's a script filled with a hyperlink every 3 or 4 lines because it's a photo reference to something that maybe Annie wouldn't be familiar with. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we had on Jeff Johns in the past, and he was talking about working on Redcoat with Brian, and
Ah,
he's like, "Hey, we're gonna go to Boston for like a week and take photos of buildings and streets, and
ah,
be like, the fight's gonna be staged in this area of Boston, so they can get from point A to point B." And it's like, that's one that I love that when that stuff happens because it's historically accurate to as much as possible.
to me, my version of that I got so excited just when you said that they did that. So one of the main settings in Jane is this real life factory in Plymouth, Michigan, that was called Wall Wire. Okay, and this was like a factory that was built in the early 1900s, and they made wires. Big surprise with the name. And then what happened was when World War II breaks out, if you know anything about Metro Detroit, Plymouth is one of the farthest western suburbs of that, and all the big Metro Detroit factories, Ford and GM all started making tanks and bombers, but all those smaller, almost, suburbs don't exactly exist, but all those smaller town factories that kind of, in the spokes that go up from Detroit are all making like component parts and other things that are needed. And Wallwire got a war contract to make Marsden mats, which are like, even if you don't know the name, they're like these long strips of metal with the holes punched in them that they use to make temporary runways in the Pacific and the Atlantic. So like you didn't have to capture a runway; you could just take your planes off basically from anywhere. And so like Wallwire's making that real factory. And my grandfather and I, who, one of the people this book is dedicated to, in part of our research efforts for the book, like got a tour of that factory literally 1 week before they tore it apart and turned it into like office space. And this is the best part, they stripped it down to like its brass tacks, basically inadvertently making it look like it did in the 1940s when they're producing the Marsden mats. And my grandfather went in there with the video camera, with the phones, and just took pictures and video footage. So like when you get to like, there's a scene in the book where Jane's in the factory and there's like the classic um punch clock scene, right? Like you see the punch clock and the line of the workers going past it. That punch clock, when you see it on the wall in the book, is exactly where that punch clock was in the old days, because when they stripped it down, you could see the shadow. And I got like the photo of the
Mm.
shadow of the punch clock where it wasn't stained on the wall. I mean, down to that kind of stuff. And you know what? It's a lot of work. It was a lot of time. But like when it means something to you, or when you're like a history nerd, or when you get to do it with your grandfather who was like actually there and lived it, it was a pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's reading the book, it's really touching because there's like things we don't really appreciate, I think, sometimes about like what our parents or grandparents went through to get us to where we are today. And so when we get to like relive those moments of, wow, you got this is what you went through, and you get to kind of touch a little bit of their life in those moments, that's really powerful. And how has that been in this comic book, trying to be like, hey, how do I bring, like, I know historical accuracy is a big thing, but really you're bringing like an educational aspect of this is how things were at that time, and also very personal aspects of people's lives that mean a ton to you. So how do you like bring that in, but also you have some non you got some fictional elements as well. How's that balancing like the fictional but also the historical, and also like those big emotional pieces of it?
Oh, it's funny that you see that, because that's probably the other thing that I've discovered over the last 5 years about who I am as a comic book writer. And that is that, well, the analogy is this. As a comic book reader, as a comic book collector since I was like 12 years old, minus the obligatory step away in the middle of my teen years until I was in my 20s, and then I got hooked again. I was It was a perfect 50-50, and it still is to the dichotomy of reader over here, collector chasing the grails and the keys and the shiny covers over here. And a lot of times it's like this, and sometimes it's in harmony. And I think as a writer of comic books, it's also this 50-50 split where I want to make sure that there is the comic book trapping of some kind of genre story, some kind of, something that comic book fans can recognize. In the case of Parallel, it was a dark sci-fi twisted tale, right? Scary comic. In this, you've got hints of, superhero. You've got hints of powers, a young protagonist who can do things that other people can't. But the other thing is, and the other balancing act is, I'm not writing stories unless there is some kind of deep, universal, relatable themes attached to it, and usually some kind of personal attachment to me. I mean, my first book is that dark sci-fi twisted tale, but it's a book about existential dread, about time passing, about dreams deferred, about making choices, and maybe it's too late to get a second chance at them. And it was probably a midlife crisis that got me off my butt to write that very first comic script in the first place. So I mean, there's personal things being exercised in that. This is a very, very personal story to me because it's named after and inspired by my late grandmother, who went through all of these universal truths about identity and gender and self-worth and self-fulfillment and being who you are in a world that tells you something different. Right? It's dedicated to every single kid who's gone through my classroom the last 2.5 decades who still struggle with all those same things today, even though that should be ridiculous here in the 21st century. And then and I guess I kind of hinted at this before, it's now very much dedicated to my now late grandfather, who just last year at the age of 99, when he realized he wasn't going to make it to 100, and boy, did that make him angry. I mean, he was a World War II veteran who like really, really wanted that round number, like bad of 100. And but like when he realized he wasn't going to make it, like he looked at me because he was a big part of this research process, and he made me promise that the book that contains the name and likeness of his high school sweetheart would see print. So this is me kind of like fulfilling that promise to them. And so it's personal, but like those universal truths, there isn't a person out there on the planet who doesn't struggle with who they are at some point, right? There isn't somebody past a certain age that doesn't deal with the existential dread about time passing. So like those universal connectable truths, and then like you're going to be able to find something hopefully relatable to that. And then you know what what I found, and this is just something maybe as a reader you instinctively pick up, certainly as an educator who teaches all kinds of different literature and ways to approach it, ways to analyze it, like it doesn't matter that the protagonist is female a certain age and it takes place in the 1940s or even a small town, because if you can find one thing to latch on to that you relate to, then the book can speak to you, and that's really important to me.
Yeah, definitely. And like those universal truths, there's maybe 10 or different comics or so that also have that same theme, but like those themes are so powerful. We keep writing stories about them because it happens in every generation, and no matter gender or location, like those things will always happen. And so we always kind of pull back to those universal truths when we're talking about storytelling. And one thing that I really liked about Jane American, and I wish more people did, is like the local history of your town. I don't think people really think that's too important as much as they used to, because we always talk about like New York, because that's where the Marvel characters are, the made up cities where Batman and Superman are. But there are people that have those stories in your local town that you can connect with. And I hope that's kind of like what Jane American does for a lot of people, not only for connecting with your local history and understanding and
Right.
valuing how far everyone has come from there to here, but also I don't know if you've ever watched or heard of Liberty Kids, where it's like revolutionary times, but it's a
Oh, cool.
cartoon and it's told from the perspective of kids.
Yeah.
And it's not really historically accurate for the small things, but they teach you like these are the battles and the Revolutionary War and how certain things come to happen. But you learn so much just about history. And so like I hope Jane American and other comics like this do both those things for people.
don't even know if I should be saying this as an educator, but like me, I as a kid and the amount that I read, I learned just as much from the fiction that I read. I learned just as much real world lessons and historical cold hard facts from the fiction that I read as the nonfiction. Because like if you've got a good author who's doing that, who's kind of following that premise of like, well, I mean, this part is fictionalized, but like, why would I make this other thing that is right in front of me and I can write about it realistically? Why would I, twist that in a way that makes it harder to read? Like, here is the real thing about how people, whether it's just like human interaction, much less the corner of this street and that street exist. And I feel like you can learn just as much from fiction as you can from nonfiction, and sometimes things that you can't, right? Because you do have characters interacting in a way that you don't actually write about in nonfiction, because you do have different kinds of emotional lessons that you can learn or thematic lessons that you can learn that don't exactly transfer in the more black and white writing of nonfiction sometimes.
Totally, yeah. And I think one of the big aspects of, that learning from fiction, but it's kind of based in like the nonfiction is like, being able to get that material in people's hands because it doesn't really seem some of those things are like super accessible. And I feel like to your point, it's hard sometimes to recommend some of those things. You're just like, well, which parts are you going to take away? And are you going to think you're going to pass this month's history test because you just read that?
I mean, the most successful examples of educating humans in the history of human communication is by putting what you want people to learn in your entertainment. Simple as that,
Yeah.
right? We're talking about traveling troops of actors across the countryside, late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, to you want a lesson about treating people that look differently than you and have different ideas than you and treating them with respect. You put it in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in 1964 and use claymation and put it on TV every year since. Right, you become Dr. Seuss and you write, Yertle the Turtle and the Grinch and the Lorax, and let people know about these powerful messages that when you put it in black and white facts nonfiction thing, maybe you don't get as much of a response. I mean, it's Sesame Street exists and Mr. Rogers exists and are successful because exactly that.
Yeah. And you've got a lot of stuff kind of going on with what you want people to take away from Jane American, and it's all been going through Kickstarter. What's it been like working from Kickstarter for pretty much all your books? You've been working on that. What's your experience been like with everything? How well it's been received, and trying to
It's
get the
it's
book out going?
it's actually kind of new because I mean, oh, like my comic journey is very, very atypical when you look at the whole thing because my first book was not. It was not how comics were made in the 21st century. I mean, Parallel was snatched up halfway through as a script by Source Point Press, like bought and then shepherded through that process where again, like because I was so new to it, I don't even know had I would have been able to pull off the Kickstarter process at that point because everything was so new. I was so not overwhelmed, but like I had so much, I was so naive when it came to how things were made that it happening that way is probably the only way it would have happened. I probably would have gotten scared away or ran out of time to be able to do it. So like when I kickstarted the one shot last year, that was my first experience with that. And then it's funny because so this is my second Kickstarter and it's going really well, but it's one of those things where it's not necessarily easier because yeah, you've got more experience, right? But now you've also got more experience, so you know about all the hard stuff that you were blissfully ignorant about the first time through. And so there's more effort here, and there's more worry here, and there's more time put in here. So it's still kind of like a big, powerful experience. I did things a little differently this time because it's not a floppy one shot. And because graphic novels, especially a hardcover and a softcover, especially with the cover artists that we got, it is an expensive endeavor to produce that book. So like when you look at the graphic novel that's online and on Kickstarter right now, I mean, I like transparency. So like you go down to the bottom, you can see the transparency sections, and I do my pie charts. It's a $23,000 project. And actually, the reason why we started with the one shot last year is because whatever distinction, whatever toehold I got in the industry, whatever minor success Parallel was when it sold out, got me two Ringo noms, and then I got to go and lose both categories. The guy who writes Batman, which was exciting. Like all whatever that was, that doesn't translate to $23,000 on your next book. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
And so we did the one shot is almost like, I mean, it stands on its own. People loved it. It was super successful as a Kickstarter, but it was almost like proof of concept in some ways. And then what I did, planned from day one, once the order of how we were going to do it was turned around by, advice from people smarter and more experienced than me, was every single penny from the one shot, once production was paid and the creative team was paid, I didn't make a penny from it. I took every single penny of that and poured it into this to defray the cost of this, because $23,000 is not reasonable on my stress level, and certainly not reasonable for this book that I just care about and I want people to have. So we basically were able to cut the price down by four, and original goal was 5,500 because I didn't pay myself. It all just went to here. And then the other major thing that I did differently this time was I also didn't, and I got to be careful how I say this, because I understand that it is part of the appeal of how we do exclusive things on Kickstarter, and it is how a lot of people like make their living and get past those goals and have actually something for themselves. But I didn't, because it's a hardcover and a soft cover, as beautiful as those covers are. You go check those out, and one's by Sina Grace and one is by Lauren Nalepa, who is a humble public school teacher like me, but is about to leap past me in fame in the comic world, because there is an NDA thing that we cannot really talk about right now, but she is about to cut a very big deal and be much more famous than me almost instantaneously. But like you look at that stuff, and the exclusive cover game on Kickstarter, which is you see a hardcover by a comics icon like Cena, and a hardcover of this size, 132 pages. We hit a stretch goal, so the book's going to be more like 150 pages with the back matter. I mean, it's $100 book, and the soft cover is gorgeous, and it's going to be 150, and that's like a $50 book. But I just wasn't interested in that this time, because it's about getting this story to people's hands that they care about so much. So I basically priced it at the exact same price that it would be on the bookshelf at the LCS, at Barnes and Noble, at wherever. So it's really just 20 and $40. Now, does that make it more difficult? Am I tying my hands behind my back financially to hit those kind of goals that would turn it into what people would consider, one of those, massively successful Kickstarters? Yeah, but that's also not the point. I mean, I'm a public school teacher. I make 12, 15 cents a year. I'll be fine. This is not what that is about. And so I just did it a little bit differently, and hopefully that's appealing to some people as well.
Yeah, I really think it is because, like, if you haven't listened to this episode very much so far yet, or you haven't listened to our podcast in general, you'll hear from more people than just Jason that it's just so expensive to make comics. The fact that I can go to a local comic book shop and say, hey, this issue is $3-4. It's like, how is it that much money when really it should be like 10 to 15?
It's really, really expensive. And that was something else. That was a big learning curve for me, doing it this way, because like I remember when I signed my contract with SourcePoint, and it was what it was, again, because it was like, man, that's a very good deal, financially for me. And now I know it's because to produce those books it was so much money. And that was just a company taking a risk on me as a first-time comic book writer. So like being on this side of it and even deeper into the production thing, I appreciate that even more.
Yeah. Well, you've got the Kickstarter for Jane American happening right now. There's still, as of this recording, I believe we still have about 3 weeks left on it. People can check out that, but what can they also expect from you in the future?
Well, I mean, short term, we're doing this. I'm going to get the books to people. I'll probably tour it for a year. I'm hoping to shop it to like Scholastic and some other companies like that. I mean, that's like the pipe dream, right? That's the teacher in me. Get it into classrooms, get it into libraries, get into as many people's hands as possible. But I wrote something else this summer with my editor, Dr. Christy Blanche, and that's something you can probably look for next year from Four Color Fiends, a publishing company. There might be an alien dog and his prepubescent friend who go out and deal with bullies and things like that. Definitely a more of a younger reader kind of thing, but also a lot of fun. So that's
Nice.
something I also worked on this summer, while putting this together and approving pages. And you know what? I'm going to keep this going as long as I can. It is certainly something I'm very passionate about. Certainly, this dream come true since I was probably about 12 years old. And better late than never, right?
Yeah, exactly. Keep riding that wave, man. And where can people find you so they can stay up to date with what's going on with Jane American and everything else?
Obviously, you can go see, the Jane American Kickstarter on Kickstarter right now. Search up Jane American or Jason Douglas or Jane American, the graphic novel. But honestly, I've got one piece of social media, one place you can find me, and that's Instagram. And that's the teacher, right? That's the, I had a zero social media footprint for so long. I stayed off of it because, like, you hear a horror story every other week about some teacher who posted some dumb thing on Facebook and suddenly, bye bye job. And so I like avoided it like the plague forever, but it was like part of the contract with SourcePoint because they were exploding at that time and becoming kind of like almost a mid-major. And the reality is it's still indie comics and you still have to do a lot of self-promoting. So you can find me on Instagram. It's J at J Douglas Writes. You can't miss me. The little icon is me in a hospital gown flexing like with an IV in my hand post colon cancer surgery, trying to be tougher than I felt at that day. And I'll talk your ear off. If you got questions, you got comments, yeah, we'll chat. Go and find
Awesome.
me.
Yeah, check them out. Check out Jane American on Kickstarter at the moment. There's less than 3 weeks left available for grabbing this book, but you're definitely want to grab it. It's a great story. It's reasonably priced from what we've learned. And also, I've got to say, I can't appreciate enough the pie chart. I can't say, I believe I'm saying, yeah, I appreciate a pie chart. Because when I scroll down on the Kickstarter, I was like, wow, this makes complete sense. Yeah, I feel like it encourages me one to give you more money because I know exactly where everything is going and
It's
how it
it's
goes
like,
down.
okay,
So,
look. It's for people who don't understand, like really fully don't understand Kickstarter. Let's be clear. This is not. There's a vibe because it's funding a project. There seems to sometimes be this public vibe about it. It's like begging for money. You're getting product. And in my case, you're literally dollar for dollar getting product to the exact same price as it would be on the shelf at your bookstore. But like whenever money is exchanging hands, I don't know. I don't know what it is, but I want it to be transparent. I want you to know exactly where every single penny is going and how we even form this differently. And then we can't believe this. We can't end because I would be remiss. So here I am kind of like literally talking down the collectability of this book because it's really a book I want you to read, even with those wonderful covers and stuff. And then the collector side of me is literally screaming in my brain, like, why are you telling me this? Because you know you did something for your degenerate collector nerds out there. So if you scroll down the page, there's a giveaway attached to this. And
oh,
if you're watching, you can see this, and if you're listening, you can go and look at the page. But I am giving away to one lucky backer my 9.8 slab of it's the Donnie Darko homage foil variant of one of the parallel variants from way back in the day. Only 100 of these were made. They sold out from the person who made the variant in less than 12 minutes. We saw a 9.6 go for like $400 online last year, and I'm going to give away this 9.8 to one lucky backer.
wow. I mean, the story alone is enough for people to probably
Just for
want to.
fun.
Yeah, the story alone is enough for me to want to be, hey, let's pledge, let's get this going. But like now that there's a giveaway, you know, definitely invest and support this book, this story, and I can't wait to see what comes out next in the future, man, because everything so far has been great and we'll have to just wait and see. And with
Cool.
that, bada boom.
Thank you for listening to the Badaboom podcast. Keep the conversation going on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Get in the comments on our YouTube channel and let us know what you'd like to hear next. And please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen.